Ever look at a map? You see this tiny little island, and then you realize it once ruled a huge chunk of the planet. How on earth did that happen? Well, it's an incredible story, and it's all about ambition, big business, and a change that literally redrew the world map.
I mean, get this. At its peak, the British Empire covered a quarter of all the land on Earth, a quarter, and it ruled over almost a third of everybody alive. The scale is it's mind-boggling, hard to even wrap your head around.
So yeah, the big question is, how? How did this one little island pull off something no one had ever done before? Okay, let's get into it.
All right, so let's start at the very beginning. And I mean way back, before Britain was even a thing. Because, and this is the crazy part, the empire wasn't really started by kings or generals. No, it was started by something totally different.
Okay, so our story actually begins not with swashbuckling pirates on the high seas, but on a neighboring island. It was a conflict that would basically become a laboratory for conquest.
So for 800 years, Ireland was the testing ground. Seriously, this is where the British Crown first developed and refined all its methods of control, of settlement, of just taking what it wanted. This wasn't just about grabbing land. It was about creating the blueprint, the actual playbook, for the empire that was coming.
It all kicked off with this brand new idea for a business, the joint stock company. Think of it like a 1600s version of crowdfunding. Instead of a king having to pay for some super risky voyage to the other side of the world, anybody could buy a piece of the action, a share, and hope for a massive payday. The big one, the one you've probably heard of, was the East India Company. Queen Elizabeth I gave them the go-ahead back in 1600. And you gotta remember this part. It wasn't the government. It was a private company, all about making money for its investors.
So, while England's companies are getting rich, Scotland decides, hey, we want a piece of that. They tried to set up their own colony in Panama, and it was an absolute, total disaster. The whole thing, called the Darien Scheme, basically bankrupted the country's elite. They were broke. And that financial desperation, that's a huge reason why in 1707, Scotland said, all right, fine, and joined up with England to create Great Britain. They needed to get in on that sweet, sweet colonial trade.
Okay, so now we have Great Britain, and this new kingdom looks west, across the Atlantic, to North America. That's where the money was. This was going to be the heart of their first empire. But, well, it didn't exactly go to plan.
The 7 Years' War was a game changer. Britain wins big, kicking the rivals, the French, out of North America and India. They're on top of the world. But winning a world war is expensive, like unbelievably expensive. The country was left with this crushing debt, about £161 million, which was just a mind-blowing amount of money back then. And, someone's got to pay the bills.
And that debt? It lit a fuse. The government in London thought, hey, the American colonies should help pay for a war that was fought to protect them. So, boom, new taxes. But the colonists were furious. They had no say, no vote in Parliament, which is where we get that famous line, no taxation without representation. What started as an argument over taxes just blew up into an all-out war for independence.
And guess what? Britain lost. For the world's biggest superpower, it was a massive, humiliating defeat. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 made it official. The United States was its own country. And just like that, the first British Empire was gone. They'd lost their golden goose. So they had no choice. They had to look somewhere else.
So, licking their wounds from the American Revolution, Britain turns its eyes to the east, to Asia. Now, this wasn't a totally new plan. Remember that East India Company? They'd been quietly working away in India for more than a century and a half, building up their influence. But now they weren't a side project anymore. They became the main event.
And this is where the story gets absolutely insane. The East India Company stopped being just a company. It basically became its own country. It was printing its own currency, it had its own courts, and get this, it built its own private army. By the year 1800, this corporation had an army of over 200,000 soldiers. That's bigger than the actual armies of most European countries at the time. A company with its own army.
It all came down to two major battles. First, Plassey in 1757. The company wins, and suddenly they're in control of Bengal, which was one of the wealthiest places on the planet. Then, a few years later at Buxar, the company's army faces off against the actual Mughal emperor and wins again. Just let that sink in. A private company just defeated an emperor. That's the moment everyone realized who was really in charge.
So with their military muscle, India becomes the absolute economic heart of this new Second Empire. It was famously called the jewel in the crown. But to really grasp what that means, in the sheer scale of what happened next, you have to understand what India was before the British really took charge. Okay, just look at this. Back in 1700, before British rule really took hold, India's economy accounted for 27% of the entire world's economy. 27%, that's more than all of Europe put together. We're not talking about some undeveloped place here. This was a global economic superpower. So what was the big difference between the British and other rulers like the Mughals who came before them? It's pretty simple, actually. The Mughals, yeah, they came from outside, but they made India their home. They lived there, they died there, and the money they collected in taxes, it got spent in India. The British were different. For them, India was always somewhere else. It was a resource, a place to extract wealth from and ship it back home to Britain. So what happened next was a deliberate takedown of India's industry. British companies were handed monopolies. There were even reports of soldiers literally smashing Indian weaving looms and maiming the people who used them. They slapped huge 80% taxes on any textiles India tried to sell abroad. The goal was to transform India from a competitor into a customer, a place to sell British stuff to, and a place to get cheap raw materials from. And all those raw materials? They fueled Britain's own industrial revolution.
Look, this wasn't some unfortunate side effect. This was the plan all along. And you don't have to take my word for it. A British Prime Minister, the Marquess of Salisbury, said it himself. He said that India was to be bled, and that the lancet should be aimed where the money was. Bled. His word, not mine.
The human cost of this was just catastrophic. We're talking an estimated 35 million deaths from famines under British rule. And what makes it even more tragic is that these famines were often made worse because the British were still exporting grain out of India for profit, even while its own people were starving.
And the money? The total amount of wealth drained out of India? Modern economists have tried to put a number on it. The estimate is around $43 trillion in today's money. It's a number that's almost too big to imagine. And that wealth, taken from India, is what helped pay for Britain to become the most powerful nation on Earth.
But no empire lasts forever, and this one, built on extraction, was no different. Even when it looked like it was at its most powerful, in the Victorian era, you could already see the cracks starting to form. The sun was beginning to set.
The first big warning shot came right at the start of the 20th century, the Boer War. The all-powerful British Empire got bogged down, struggling to beat a small group of Dutch farmers in South Africa. And to make matters worse, when they tried to recruit more soldiers back home, they found that something like 40% of the men were too sick or malnourished to even fight. It was a huge shock to the system. The idea that Britain was invincible, that myth was shattered.
But the real knockout punches were World War I and World War II. Britain was on the winning side, sure, but at what cost? The wars completely emptied the country's bank accounts and cost millions of lives. The simple fact was, Britain was broke. It just couldn't afford an empire anymore. When India gained independence in 1947, that was the domino that set the rest off. The whole thing unraveled pretty quickly after that, with the symbolic end coming in 1997 when Hong Kong was handed back to China.
So, that brings us to now. The empire's gone, right? Well, not really. The political entity is gone, but its legacy? It's everywhere. It's in the lines drawn on maps, the languages people speak, and the huge economic gaps between countries that still exist today. That model of taking wealth from one place to build up another, that didn't just happen in India. So yeah, you could say the sun is set on the British Empire, but we're going to pull on a thread that runs through centuries of British history. It's a story all about power, a kind of power that just changes its clothes, but never really changes its mission. It sounds like one of those old riddles, doesn't it? But the answer, well, it unlocks this incredible playbook that has basically shaped our modern world. And it all starts with a really simple, kind of dangerous idea. What if you could have power that operates outside the rules?
Now, you might think that's describing, I don't know, a modern tech giant, right? But no, that was written about a company that started over 400 years ago. And that is a massive clue in our story. So, all right, let's dive in.
And at the very same time, the Crown was perfecting this other tool, one for projecting its power out on the open sea. See, a privateer, they weren't just a pirate. Think of them as an entrepreneur of violence, but with a government contract. They were literally given state permission to go out, rob, and plunder Spanish ships, all in exchange for a slice of the pie.
So you have this model, right? State-sanctioned private power. Well, it was about to be scaled up, like to a level the world had never, ever seen before. It wasn't just going to create a company, it was going to create a corporate empire.
So in the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signs a piece of paper, a royal charter, for a group of merchants. On the surface, the East India Company was just a joint stock corporation, like any other business. But this charter gave it the power to wage war, to sign treaties, to rule over territory. It was a private business that could act like its own country.
And to make sure it got what it wanted, the company built its very own private army. I mean, just look at that number, 260,000 men at its peak. This force wasn't fighting for a nation or for a king, they were fighting for shareholders. Their one and only mission was to secure profit, usually by seizing control.
And this absolute focus on profit, on the bottom line, well, it had truly catastrophic consequences. Take the Great Bengal Famine. The company's policies, things like hoarding grain and jacking up taxes, they didn't just fail to help, they made the crisis so much worse. We're talking about an estimated 10 million people dead. The bottom line always came first, no matter the human cost.
And the long-term economic impact? I mean, it's just staggering. Through a deliberate policy of, deindustrialization, imposing monopolies, slapping on harsh duties, Britain systematically hollowed out India's entire economy. You had a nation that was once this global manufacturing powerhouse, and it was transformed it to just a captive source of raw materials for factories back in Britain.
So eventually, the formal empire, the one with flags and maps, it starts to decline. But the playbook? Oh, it didn't disappear, not at all. It just evolved. It moved from the very open power of a corporate state to the much more subtle influence of an invisible network.
So power started to get embedded in these new kinds of organizations. You've got everything from secret societies like the Round Table, founded by Cecil Rhodes, to super influential think tanks like Chatham House. The goal of all these private groups was to shape public policy from behind the scenes, creating these elite networks that operated way outside of public view.
And get this, Chatham House, which is actually the Royal Institute of International Affairs, they created a rule to literally formalize this secrecy, the Chatham House Rule. It lets the powerful speak completely freely, without any public accountability. So here's the crucial point. The old method of operating with sanctioned secrecy, it was now codified, all packaged up for the modern age.
Right, so the physical empire, the colonies, they're gone. But the operating system behind it all, the secrecy, the operating beyond the rules, the lack of accountability, that is alive and well.
So where did all that wealth and where did those methods go? Well, the answer lies in a modern system that looks eerily similar to the old playbook. It's a whole network of places where the normal rules of accountability just don't apply. When journalists dug into the Panama Papers, they found out that setting up one of these offshore shell companies is just shockingly easy. A couple of clicks on a website, a wire transfer, and boom, you're the beneficial owner of a completely untraceable company. The entire system is built from the ground up to make wealth invisible.
And here's the kicker. A lot of these key offshore havens, places like the British Virgin Islands, they aren't actually foreign countries. They are British overseas territories. They're a direct leftover from the empire, operating under Britain's legal protection, but completely outside its rules on tax and transparency.
And this right here, this is the modern-day letter of marque, the pirate's license. It's a legal promise that the laws of other countries, like Germany in this case, have no power here. It creates this protected, untouchable space for wealth, exactly like the Royal Charter once did for the East India Company.
So, from a pirate's charter to a banker's shell company, what we're really seeing is the evolution of a single powerful idea. You create these legally sanctioned entities that exist outside the normal territory, all so you can project power and pile up wealth, completely beyond the reach of conventional law.
And all of this leaves us with one pretty provocative question. If an empire gives up its land but just gets better and better at its methods, has it really ended? Maybe what we're looking at today isn't the ghost of an empire at all. Maybe, just maybe, it's its most successful and refined form yet. A system of power that doesn't need to conquer territory anymore, because it has absolutely perfected the art of operating beyond it.